Karl Marx. There's a name that gets a reaction, right? Whether you think of him as a genius revolutionary or the mind behind failed states, you just can't deny that his ideas have profoundly shaped our world for over 150 years. So today, we're going to cut through all that noise and get right to the core arguments from his most famous works, the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. So you might be asking, why are we even talking about a philosopher from the 19th century today? Well, it's because the very questions he was asking seem to be echoing louder than ever. I mean, you look around, you see wealth gaps getting wider, society's feeling more and more divided, and it makes you wonder. A lot of people are looking back at Marx's work, not for some magic answer, but as a really powerful lens to understand the systems we're all living in right now. All right, so to really get a grip on Marx, here's our roadmap. First, we'll tackle why he's still so relevant. Then, we're diving deep into the heart of his theory, this idea of a huge conflict between two major classes that he believed is the engine of all history. After that, we'll look at the kind of world he actually wanted to create, and finally, we'll ask that really tough question. Was his vision just a brilliant idea, or was it fundamentally flawed? So, first up, why should we bother with a guy from the 1800s? Well, because Marx gives us this incredible toolkit for taking a hard look at the world. He makes us ask these really critical questions about things we might just take for granted. Things like why a CEO might earn hundreds of times more than their average worker. He basically challenges us to pop the hood on our economic system and see how it really works. Now, here is a truly radical idea from Marx. Capitalism is not the end of the line. It's not the final destination of human history. And what's interesting is he actually had a lot of respect for its power, how it could generate incredible wealth and drive innovation. But he also saw it as a deeply unstable system, one that was just packed with internal problems that would eventually cause it to break down, kind of like feudalism did before it. Okay, so if capitalism's just a phase, what's the force that's supposed to replace it? Well, this brings us to the absolute engine of Marx's entire theory. A fundamental conflict. He argued that our modern society, for all its complexity, really boils down to one central struggle between two huge opposing classes. On one side, you've got the bourgeoisie. So think of them as the owners of the factories, the land, the tech companies, what Marx called the means of production. And on the other side, you have the proletariat. That's the working class. They don't own any of that stuff. The only thing they have to sell is their own ability to work, which they have to sell to the bourgeoisie just to get by. And for Marx, this massive divide is the source of all the conflict. And Marx paints a really bleak picture of what this system does to people. He argued that this kind of industrial work makes people feel disconnected or alienated from their own labor. You're no longer this skilled craftsman who's proud of what you're making. You're just a part of the machine, an appendage, doing the same boring, soul-crushing task over and over and over. And believe me, he did not mince his words. For Marx, this was basically a new form of slavery. It wasn't just about having a bad boss. The worker, he said, is enslaved by the whole system, by the machine they operate, the supervisor watching over them, and by the entire economic structure of the state that keeps it all in place. So you have to wonder, was this huge clash between classes just some kind of historical accident? Well, not for Marx. Not at all. He saw history as a predictable process, a march forward that was always driven by conflict. The economic struggles of one era, he believed, always and inevitably set the stage for the next. This right here is one of the most famous lines ever written in political philosophy. It's the absolute core of his theory of history. What he's saying is, if you really want to understand any period, from ancient Rome to the modern day, you need to look at who controlled the stuff, the resources, and who was forced to do the work for them. It's all one long story of class struggle. The fancy term for this idea is historical materialism. The basic concept is that a society's economy, who owns what and how things get made, that's the foundation. And everything else, our laws, our politics, our culture, even our deepest beliefs, is built right on top of that economic base. And the dominant ideas in any society, well, they're simply the ideas that serve the interests of the dominant class. So this creates a pretty clear timeline in history. The fight between feudal lords and serfs, that didn't just fizzle out. It exploded, and it gave birth to our modern capitalist world. But this new society created its own signature conflict, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. So for Marx, the next logical, inevitable step in this march of history was a revolution, one led by the workers. Which brings us to Marx's proposed solution, I mean, after all this blistering critique of the system, what was the alternative? What did he want to build? And we're not talking about just tweaking a few policies. He had a vision for a completely new, totally different kind of society. Now, this might not sound like the communism you've heard about. For Marx, the ultimate goal wasn't some gray, oppressive state that crushes individuality. It was a society specifically designed to help every single person flourish, based on this beautiful idea that my freedom is only truly possible when you are also free. Okay, but how do you get there? Well, the manifesto actually lists some concrete first steps, and honestly, some of them might surprise you. Things like a heavy progressive income tax or state control over credit and transportation. I mean, look at this list. A lot of these policies now exist in some form in many modern capitalist countries, which is a pretty fascinating historical irony when you think about it. But ultimately, for Marx, all of this came down to one thing: political power. The immediate goal wasn't just to cause chaos. Now, the first and most essential step was for the working class majority to take control of the state, to, in his words, win the battle of democracy, and then use that power to start reshaping the economy from the top down. And that leads us to our final and maybe most difficult question. If that was the vision, what went so wrong? Why is the name Marx so often tied to authoritarian regimes, to gulags, and to economic collapse? Well, this is where we have to look at a really crucial argument. The source material we're working from here suggests that there's a huge difference between Marx's actual philosophy and what those 20th century states that called themselves communist actually did. The claim is that these regimes weren't the fulfillment of his ideas at all, but a complete and total distortion of them. In fact, the source goes even further. It argues that Marx, the man who was a fierce critic of state oppression and the exploitation of workers, would have been one of the biggest critics of those very same dictatorial regimes that claimed to be acting in his name. It's this powerful idea of trying to separate the original theory from how it was corrupted later on. And so we're left with this fundamental question. Do the horrific failures of 20th century communism mean that Marx's entire critique of capitalism is wrong? Or is that central conflict he identified, that constant struggle between capital and labor, between profit and people, still the defining tension of our world today? That really is the question his legacy forces every single one of us to confront.